"You belong to my bed, not the streets," Lone Cowboy declared to the giant homeless girl. Witness this unbelievable, true, inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The night was quiet in Austin, Texas, though the streets carried their usual rhythm of music, neon lights, and hurried footsteps. The bars pulsed with country tunes, and laughter spilled out of swinging doors, but not everyone had somewhere warm to go. On the corner of 6th Street, under the flickering glow of a worn-out street lamp, sat a figure who seemed both out of place and yet tragically rooted to the spot. A girl, tall beyond ordinary measure, with shoulders slumped and knees drawn close to her chest, stared blankly at the cracked pavement. She looked like a giant compared to those passing by, yet her presence drew more whispers than kindness. Some stared at her with pity, some with unease, and most simply walked faster, as if her existence made them uncomfortable. Her clothes were torn and oversized, barely clinging to her frame. The cold September wind blew through her tangled hair, whipping strands across her face. Hunger had hollowed her cheeks, and fatigue had dulled the once bright spark in her hazel eyes. Her body, despite its size and strength, carried the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many silent battles. She had nowhere to go, no hand to hold, and no place to belong. Then the sound of boots broke the monotony of the night, steady, slow, confident. The kind of stride that carried both purpose and history. Jackson Reed, a cowboy in his late 30s, had just finished selling cattle and supplies in town. His wide-brimmed hat shielded his weather-worn face, his coat carried the dust of long days on the ranch, and his steel-blue eyes held the calm of a man who had seen storms and survived them. He wasn't supposed to stop, wasn't supposed to notice anyone in particular. But life has a way of placing people exactly where they need to be, even if neither of them knows why. He saw her, the giant girl sitting alone, shivering against the night, trying to make herself invisible, though her size made her unforgettable. Jackson slowed his stride, adjusting the tilt of his hat. Most men might have looked once and kept walking, but his boot stopped firmly on the sidewalk. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying both respect and authority. It startled her. She wasn't used to being spoken to kindly. Mostly she was told to move along, mocked for her height, or ignored as if she were nothing. She looked up at him with suspicion, her lips trembling from both cold and fear. "You talking to me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from silence. Jackson crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. That simple act, lowering himself rather than towering over her, was enough to soften her defenses. "Yes, ma'am. You don't belong out here. Not like this." She let out a bitter laugh, though it cracked halfway. "This is all I've got. Streets don't ask questions. They just take." Jackson studied her face in the glow of the streetlight. There was a strength in her, even beneath the exhaustion, but also a heartbreaking loneliness. He could have walked away, pretended she was just another lost soul, but something deep inside him refused. He leaned closer, his voice steady, his words deliberate. "No, you belong to my bed, not the streets." At first she blinked in disbelief. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Not with desire, not with pity, but with conviction. His words weren't vulgar, though they could have been misunderstood. They weren't empty, though they could have sounded like a joke. They were a declaration, plain and simple. A man's promise to a woman who had long forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, protected, and respected. Her throat tightened. "Why would you say that to me? You don't even know me." Jackson's eyes didn't waver. "Maybe not. But I know enough. Ain't no one meant to freeze on concrete while the world keeps spinning. You got a soul, ma'am, and that means you deserve better than what I'm seeing." For the first time in years, she felt something pierce through the heavy armor of loneliness. It wasn't just kindness, it was recognition. Someone finally saw her. Not as a freak, not as a burden, not as a nameless shadow, but as a woman worth speaking to, worth saving. She hesitated when he reached out a hand. Her instinct told her to retreat, to distrust, because the streets had taught her that nothing came free. But there was something about the way his hand didn't push, didn't demand. It waited, patient, unshakable. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. It was large, calloused, and warm. His grip wasn't crushing but secure, as if promising she wouldn't fall. For a girl who had been abandoned, forgotten, and invisible, that single act was enough to break her silence. He helped her to her feet, and even standing tall above him, she felt small inside. Jackson didn't flinch at her size, didn't mock or stare. Instead, he simply adjusted his hat and said, "Come on, let's get you out of here." They walked side by side down the quiet street, the city lights fading behind them. Every step she took felt surreal. She couldn't believe she was following a stranger, couldn't believe someone had stopped for her. But the warmth of his presence was undeniable. She hadn't felt safe in years, yet with him, even the silence carried comfort. When they reached his old Ford truck parked at the edge of the street, she froze. Her instinct screamed that this was where good things ended, where kindness usually revealed hidden costs. Jackson opened the passenger door and stepped back, giving her space. "You don't have to, ma'am. But if you're tired of cold streets, I got a warm bed waiting. No strings." Her eyes widened. She searched his face for lies, for hidden intentions. But his gaze was steady, his tone calm. She clutched her torn blanket tighter, the weight of her decision pressing heavy. Finally, she climbed in, her long frame folding awkwardly into the seat. Jackson shut the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. The drive out of Austin was quiet. Neon lights gave way to dark highways, and highways gave way to open fields, stretching beneath a blanket of stars. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching the world blur past, wondering if she was dreaming. Jackson didn't ask questions. He didn't demand her story. He let the night speak for them both. But every so often, he glanced at her, at the girl fate had placed in his path, and thought to himself that maybe, just maybe, this was where both their stories began to change. When the truck turned down a gravel road leading to wide-open land, the faint outline of a ranch appeared. A small house stood under the moonlight, lights glowing warm from inside. Horses shifted in the distance, their silhouettes calm against the horizon. For the giant homeless girl, it was a sight she hadn't seen in years, a place that felt alive, not just surviving. The truck came to a stop. Jackson shut off the engine and tipped his hat toward her. "Welcome home, Mom. For tonight, this place is yours too." She swallowed hard, her chest aching with emotions she couldn't name. No one had ever said those words to her. Home, hers. Too overwhelmed to speak, she simply followed him toward the door, where the smell of hay, wood, and lavender greeted her. Inside, he handed her a flannel shirt, clean and warm. Then, with no fuss, he set a steaming bowl of stew on the table. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon, every bite tasting like a memory she thought she'd lost. Jackson didn't hover, didn't pry. He simply leaned against the doorway, watching quietly, making sure she had enough. Later, he led her to a small room with a bed neatly made. The blanket was soft, the pillow plump. She touched it with disbelief, tears rising in her eyes. "Why? Why me?" she whispered. Jackson tipped his hat again, his voice low but sure. "Because every soul deserves a home. And tonight, you found yours." She curled up on the bed, her tall frame finally at peace. And as sleep took her for the first time in years, she held onto his words like a lifeline. And in that moment, the giant homeless girl no longer belonged to the streets. The night settled quietly over the Texas ranch, the kind of night where stars blanketed the sky in clusters too many to count. The air smelled of cedar and hay, and the distant sound of crickets played a rhythm steady enough to soothe even the most restless heart. Inside the small ranch house, the giant girl lay curled on a bed that seemed too soft, too unreal to belong to her. Her breath came slow, her chest rising and falling as exhaustion finally gave her the sleep she had been denied for years. The blanket warmed her like an embrace, and though the scars of the streets still pressed heavy on her soul for the first time in forever, she didn't wake up every few minutes with fear in her chest. She simply slept. Jackson Reed stood at the doorway, hat in hand, watching her with a stillness that only a cowboy could carry. He wasn't a man of many words, but his silence held weight. He knew pain when he saw it, had lived long enough to recognize someone running not from people, but from life itself. He didn't know her story, didn't need to, not yet. What he knew was simple. She needed safety tonight, and that was enough. He turned out the light and stepped away, leaving her to the rest she deserved. By dawn, the ranch came alive with the crow of roosters and the creak of wood under the morning sun. Horses shuffled in the stable, the wind rustled across the fields, and Jackson was already outside, tightening ropes, checking fences, and tending to the animals. Life on a ranch was built on rhythm, and his body had been tuned to that rhythm since boyhood. But today was different. Today, a stranger slept inside his house, a woman who carried the kind of brokenness that could either heal under kindness or collapse under its own weight. He wasn't sure which way she would go. Inside, the girl stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the soft light pouring through the window. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The softness beneath her, the smell of wood and lavender, the quiet hum of a house lived in. It was all too foreign. Panic flickered in her chest. But as her eyes landed on the flannel shirt draped across a chair, on the boots lying neatly by the door, she remembered the cowboy. His words, his hand, his silence. "You belong to my bed, not the streets." The memory made her chest ache in ways she didn't understand. She rose awkwardly, her long frame bending against the small room. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped toward the door. Every part of her wanted to flee, convinced this peace was temporary, that kindness had an expiration date. But something kept her feet moving slowly toward the smell of fresh coffee. Jackson was at the stove, frying bacon in an old cast-iron pan, his movements unhurried. He didn't look surprised when she appeared, though her towering figure nearly filled the doorway. He simply nodded toward the table. "Morning, ma'am. Coffee's hot. Sit yourself down." She hesitated, gripping the edge of her tattered blanket like a shield. You're still here." He gave a short chuckle, flipping a strip of bacon. "Where else would I be? This here's my land. Don't worry, I ain't the type to vanish overnight." She slid into a chair, the wood groaning under her weight. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around the warm mug he placed in front of her. The first sip nearly burned, but the taste was rich, grounding. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. "It's been so long since I had this." Jackson didn't press. He set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her, then sat across with his own plate. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable but steady, like the earth itself. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, raw. "You don't even know my name." Jackson wiped his mouth with a napkin, his eyes calm as they met hers. "Then tell me, ma'am." Her lips trembled before she whispered, "Eleanor. But people used to call me Ellie." "Ellie," he repeated slowly, like he was testing the weight of it. "That's a good name. Suits you." Her chest tightened. No one had said her name with such steadiness in years. On the streets, she was nameless, faceless, a ghost in plain sight. Hearing it spoken aloud without mockery felt like a piece of herself had been returned. She didn't tell him everything that morning, not about the family she had lost, not about the years of wandering from shelter to shelter, not about the cruel laughter that had chased her because of her unusual size. But she told him enough, that the streets had been home for longer than she wanted to admit, that she had learned to sleep with one eye open. That kindness usually came with a price. Jackson listened without interruption, his coffee cooling, as he watched her struggle through every word. When she finally fell silent, he leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but firm. "Ellie, you've been carrying the weight of 100 storms alone. Don't reckon anyone can do that forever. You're safe here. Ain't no debt on kindness. Not from me." Her eyes flooded with tears and she turned away, ashamed. But he didn't push her to meet his gaze. He simply stood, carried his empty plate to the sink and said, "Finish your breakfast. Then if you're up for it, I'll show you the ranch." The day unfolded slowly. Ellie followed him outside, the morning sun washing over fields that stretched farther than her eyes could see. Horses moved with grace, their coats shining in the light. Jackson handed her a brush, guiding her hands as she combed through the mane of a chestnut mare. At first she felt clumsy, her large hands awkward and unsure. But as the horse leaned into her touch, a quiet smile spread across her face, the first real smile she had felt in years. Jackson watched her from the corner of his eye, not saying much, but every glance carried unspoken approval. He knew the land had healing power, that the rhythm of tending animals and working soil could ground even the most lost soul. Ellie's laughter, soft and uncertain, drifted on the wind as a colt nuzzled against her arm. It was a sound Jackson hadn't expected, but one he knew he wanted to hear again. Days turned into weeks. Ellie began to shed the layers of fear that had clung to her for so long. She helped mend fences, carried buckets of water with ease, and even learned to ride under Jackson's patient guidance. Her size, once a curse in the eyes of the world, became an asset on the ranch. For the first time in her life, her body didn't make her an outcast. It made her capable, strong, necessary. At night, they shared quiet meals, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Jackson never pushed for more than she could give. He didn't demand her story all at once, didn't rush her healing. He simply gave her space, his presence steady as the land he worked. And little by little, Ellie began to believe his words. From that first night weren't just kindness, but truth. She didn't belong to the streets anymore. She belonged somewhere. She belonged to someone. But healing is never a straight path. Some nights Ellie woke up screaming, haunted by the cold, by the hunger, by the cruel laughter of strangers. Jackson would come to her door, never barging in, but always waiting. "You're safe, Ellie," he would say, his voice steady enough to anchor her back to the present. And though she rarely admitted it, those words saved her more than once. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Ellie stood with Jackson by the corral. Her hair, cleaner now and tied back, glowed in the light. She looked at him, her voice trembling with honesty. "Why me, Jackson? Why did you stop that night? Why didn't you just walk past like everyone else?" He rested his hands on the fence, his eyes fixed on the land. "Because I saw you. World's full of folks who pretend not to see. But I did, and once you see someone, really see 'em, you can't just walk away. Ain't in me to do it." Her throat tightened, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had been invisible for so long that being seen felt like both a gift and a burden too heavy to carry. But Jackson's gaze, when he finally turned it on her, was steady, unshaken. "You belong here, Ellie," he said softly. "With me, not with the streets." The words, echoing that first night, settled deep into her chest. They weren't just a promise anymore. They were truth, lived out in every meal, every chore, every moment of silence shared under the Texas sky. And for the first time in her life, Ellie didn't just believe him. She believed herself. She belonged.